Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography, and today I'm talking about the 2013 crime thriller, The Frozen Ground. In The Frozen Ground, Nicolas Cage plays a state trooper who's investigating a series of unsolved murders in the Alaskan wilderness that all seemingly point to an unassuming local baker, but the police lack the sufficient evidence to convict him. The investigation brings Nicolas Cage's character to a young sex worker who managed to escape the clutches of the serial killer, and using the information she provides, he attempts to bring the killer to justice. So this is yet another Nicolas Cage thriller, but this time it's dealing with a real-life murderer named Robert Hansen. And you know, we are living in a time where serial killer biopics and true crime podcasts and documentaries about killers are really popular. And I get the appeal, but I don't often go out of my way to watch or listen to that kind of thing. Partly because I find it depressing knowing that these cases really happened. I mean, I love watching horror movies, but when I watch Art the Clown do unthinkable things to women, I can sleep soundly knowing that he doesn't really exist. I also worry a little bit that we as a society are guilty of sensationalizing and romanticizing these real-life killers. But these true crime videos do get a lot of views. I mean, goddamn, look at these view counts. Well, you know what they say, if you can't beat 'em. Welcome to Georgia's True Crime Show. Robert Hansen, aka the Butcher Baker of Alaska, was born in Iowa in 1939. In high school, he experienced social rejection and was frequently bullied for his severe acne and stutter. In 1960, after being discharged from the army, Hansen set fire to his former school's bus garage. He reasoned that, "I guess I burned down the bus barn because I hated the school with a divine passion." Hansen pled guilty to arson and spent 27 months in a state reformatory, where he spoke of vengeful fantasies involving women and was diagnosed with manic depression with periodic schizophrenic episodes. But eventually he learned to play the system, and he learned how to come across as harmless and rehabilitated. Hansen got married to his second wife in 1963, and in 1967 they moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he opened his own bakery. By all accounts, Robert Hansen was a stable religious family man and an active member of the community. In 1971, Hansen attempted to abduct an 18-year-old woman at gunpoint, but her roommates saw what was happening and they called the police, who arrested him. Hansen was released on bail to await the court hearing. While he was out on bail, he assaulted and raped a woman at gunpoint. But Hansen eventually released her after she promised not to say anything to the police. Mere days later, Hansen sexually assaulted a different woman named Beth Van Zanten. It's likely that Hansen threw her into a ravine while she was bound and gagged and she froze to death. The woman that Hansen raped and then released a few days prior heard the story of Beth Van Zanten on the news and was convinced that it was Hansen that murdered her. She then told the police about her ordeal and they matched the description to Hansen. In court, Hansen pled guilty to assault with a deadly weapon, but the abduction, rape, and murder charges were dropped due to lack of sufficient evidence. The judge told Hansen, "You have a serious illness that makes you extremely dangerous," and sentenced him to 5 years in jail. However, Hansen only ended up serving a few months because he was a model prisoner. In 1975, Hansen propositioned a dancer from the Kit Kat Club. He raped her at gunpoint and then released her. The woman then gave his license plate number to a rape crisis center. Later, Hansen's parole officer asked him about this, and Hansen said that it was just a date gone wrong and she demanded that he paid him, and when he didn't, she cried rape. Later that month, Robert Hansen was apprehended for stealing a chainsaw. And in court, Hansen's parole officer said that he was under the opinion that Hansen should be behind bars. The judge sentenced Hansen to 5 years in jail, but Hansen's legal team appealed the verdict. His defense sought a psychologist who said that Hansen had been responding well to therapy and medication, and that there would be no more issues with him if he kept up the treatment. The Court of Appeal judges agreed that Robert Hansen's mental problems were treatable and he was again released on probation. But due to an administrative error, he returned to society without any guidelines or supervision. In 1979, a sex worker agreed to go to Robert Hansen's house and got into his car. Instead, Hansen held her at gunpoint and drove her into the wilderness. She tried running, but he caught up to her, overpowered her, and killed her. Her body was found a year later. This victim is referred to as Eklutna Annie after the lake she was found near, and even today she's never been identified. In May of 1980, Hansen asked 24-year-old sex worker Joanna Messina out to dinner. Apparently, he didn't know she was a sex worker until she propositioned him, and he grew annoyed that her connection to him was just strictly business. Hansen then lured her into his truck. Joanna Messina escaped, but he caught her, pistol whipped her, shot her twice, killed her dog, and dumped her dead body into a gravel pit. A year later, Hansen offered 23-year-old topless dancer Sherry Morrow $300 for a nude photo shoot. He blindfolded her and handcuffed her in his truck and drove into the wilderness. Her boyfriend told the police that she'd gone missing, but the police dismissed it, and said that young women in the area often just move away without notice, especially women with transient lifestyles. But the boyfriend persuaded the police to look for her, and in September of 1982, 2 officers found Sherry Morrow's skeletal remains. Now, for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip over a lot of the murders that Hansen committed during this time period. But at this point, his most common MO was to meet vulnerable women in the street or in a bar, and lure them into his vehicle with the promise of money. He would then hold them at gunpoint and fly them in his plane deep into the Alaskan wilderness, where he stripped them naked and had them run, and then he gunned them down like they were prey. In June 1983, a trucker in Anchorage saw a young barefoot woman in handcuffs by the road screaming, "Help me." This was Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old sex worker who Hansen held at gunpoint and led to his house, where he chained her to a support beam in his basement and raped her. He later drove her to an airport where she escaped. The truck driver then drove Cindy to a motel, where Officer Greg Baker then found her and escorted her to a hospital. Cindy told the officer her story, and the police searched Hansen's truck, aircraft, and house, but no evidence was found. Hansen was then interviewed by the police, where he denied abducting and raping Cindy. He also had an alibi that was substantiated by one of his friends. Cindy was told to take a polygraph test, but instead she skipped town with her boyfriend without telling the police. And this confirmed the suspicions of the police that she was lying, and they closed the case. But despite this, Officer Greg Baker of the Anchorage Sexual Assault Unit believed Cindy. Multiple women had been making near-identical accusations in the span of 12 years about Robert Hansen, and Officer Baker was sure that Hansen was a serial killer and a rapist. Baker put together a report on Hansen, and he delivered it to the Alaska State Troopers headquarters, where it reached Sergeant Glenn Flothy. Sergeant Flothy interviewed Cindy and believed her claims. He then reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, where BSU agent John E. Douglas, who some of you might know from his depiction in the show Mindhunter, put together a profile on the killer that almost exactly matched Robert Hansen's description. In October 1983, Sergeant Flothy interviewed Robert Hansen, who denied all accusations of murder and rape. However, around this time, Hansen's friend that had previously corroborated Hansen's alibi about his whereabouts during Cindy's abduction admitted that he lied to the police about where Hansen was, because Hansen just told him that Cindy was a prostitute that demanded more money. Now that Hansen's alibi was gone, the police searched his house again, where they found a secret room that matched Cindy's description of where she was held. They also found a hidden compartment in the attic containing a gun that matched the bullets used on his suspected victims, as well as a bag with women's rings and pendants that were recognized by the loved ones of its victims. The police also found a map with multiple black asterisks that turned out to be markings of where he buried the bodies of his victims. In 1984, Hansen confessed that he killed 4 women, including Eklutna Annie, Sherry Morrow, and Joanna Messina. He also admitted to raping and abducting Cindy. The district attorney told Hansen that he knew that he'd obviously killed much more than 4 women. Hansen eventually agreed to a deal that if he helped to locate the remaining victims, he'd only be tried for 4 murders, and his family would be left alone along with no publicity in the press. Robert Hansen then confessed to killing 17 women. Hansen was flown to the areas that he'd marked on the map to help the police find the bodies of the victims. The remains of 11 out of the 17 victims that he admitted to killing were found, but investigators are certain that he actually killed at least 21 women. Hansen also admitted to raping 30 women. Robert Hansen was sentenced on February 1984, where District Attorney Frank Rothschild called him an extreme aberration of a human being. And during the trial, the judge said, "The court system has failed. If ever there was a case where a defendant or a man needed surveillance for the rest of his life, it's this gentleman here, and it's been known for many years. Here we've turned a person loose several times, knowing he has the propensity for what he did. There's absolutely no excuse for it." Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison. Hansen spent 30 years in jail until 2014, where he was transferred to a regional hospital, where he died of a chronic illness at the age of 75. And thank God that that piece of shit is dead in the ground right now. Is this how true crime podcasts are supposed to go? Now, I was kind of exaggerating earlier when I criticized movies and shows based on real-life serial killers. I'm not completely averse to that kind of thing. As of now, as far as I can tell, The Frozen Ground is the only movie that exists that's directly about Robert Hansen. Apparently there was a movie in 2007 called Naked Fear that was loosely inspired by his MO. And also there's Dexter New Blood, which I just watched recently and it was pretty good. And you can tell that Clancy Brown's character was clearly partially based on Hansen. And I think that the case of Robert Hansen is absolutely actually a story that's worth being told. Not only for the fascinating duality of the family man that was really a ruthless murderer, but also because it showcases the complete ineptitude of the police and the justice system in the way that they failed those poor women. And I will say that the Nicolas Cage movie The Frozen Ground does make a clear attempt to be faithful in its depiction of the case of Robert Hansen. Director Scott Walker spent over 2 years researching the case, and hired both journalists and court researchers to access previously unreported information that appears in the film. State Trooper Sergeant Glenn Flothy also worked with the director as a consultant and script advisor in the movie. The director also located the real Cindy Paulson and interviewed her for more than 50 hours, and this was the first time she ever agreed to be interviewed about the case. The dialogue and the interview scenes in the film between Glenn Flothy and Hansen were taken directly from police transcripts. And in some scenes, the photos used of the victims are actually pictures of the real-life women. I've also seen pictures of what the interior of Robert Hansen's house actually looked like, and the filmmakers did a great job at recreating that in the movie. So I do appreciate that the director went above and beyond to ensure authenticity in his depiction of the events. And the movie does show a lot of the key events in the case that will sound familiar if you're paying attention during George's true crime show. The movie starts with Officer Glenn Baker finding Cindy Paulson handcuffed in the hotel. We see Cindy being laughed off and dismissed by other cops, but Officer Baker leaves the file to the state troopers who pick up the case. The state trooper notices similarities between Cindy's description of the attack and victims like Uklutna Annie. They eventually look into Robert Hansen, and we see him in his bakery, and we see that he presents himself as a pillar of the community. But we also see a glimpse into the other side of Robert Hansen, the man that forced women into the wilderness and shot them. At one point, an FBI profile is made of the killer, which sounds just like the real-life profile made by John E. Douglas. The movie also shows the police's struggle to find tangible evidence of Robert Hansen's crimes until he's interrogated, and his hidden stash of guns and trinkets are found in a hidden part of the attic, as well as the map with the markings of his victims, and he eventually confesses, and we briefly see him lead the officers to the various victims' bodies. So all of that stuff is completely true to real life as far as I can tell. But I think my biggest issue with this movie is that it starts way too late into Robert Hansen's crime spree. The movie starts in the year 1983, and at that point Hansen had been killing women for about 12 years. And I think by starting the story there, the movie breezed by some really important stuff. Like, if I was adapting the Robert Hansen story, I would definitely start with that part I talked about earlier. That in 1971, Robert Hansen got caught by the police trying to abduct a woman, he got released on bail, and then he raped a woman and he killed a different woman and he only got a few months in jail. And then he went right back to raping and killing afterwards. I think that if that was the first act of this movie, it would really set the tone for what we're dealing with. And also it would highlight the failings of the judicial system, which this movie doesn't really do. But even though the movie barely shows Robert Hansen's crimes, when they do, it is quite effective. There's 2 scenes in this movie depicting Hansen that are genuinely haunting. The part that got to me was the scene with Hansen in his den casually listening to a record. And then the camera pans around to a woman that he has chained up and she's crying and apologizing profusely for urinating on the floor. It's creepy stuff. In my review of 8mm, I talked about how some people consider that to be Nicolas Cage's most disturbing movie. But honestly, I think The Frozen Ground is quite possibly Nicolas Cage's most disturbing movie to me. Because even though the scenes of murder in the movie are brief, it's the fact that whenever you're looking at a dead woman in the film, I know that that represents a woman in real life that was raped and killed, which is very unnerving and depressing. But instead of the whole movie being about depicting Hansen murdering women, the movie instead fixates on the 3 figures of the state trooper, Cindy Paulson, and Robert Hansen. And with that, there's room for more character moments and arcs. I also thought the investigation portions of the movie were done well. The movie certainly gets across the frustration of having insufficient evidence to arrest Hansen despite all signs obviously pointing towards him. There's also an interesting cat and mouse element to the story. Actually, it's kind of more like a cat and mouse and dog element. Because you have the state troopers closing in on Hansen, who in turn is trying to hunt down Cindy Paulson. I'm not entirely sure if these parts happen in real life the exact way they're shown in the movie, and I'll touch more on that in a minute. But some of those scenes are quite tense. But there's also a few little moments in this film that feel like something that would be made up for a movie, but based on the true crime podcasts I've heard, I know that they're true. Like there's a part where the police officers are talking about how Hansen said you can't rape a prostitute. Which feels like a bit of cliched screenwriting, but I've seen multiple accounts saying that Hansen really did say that. There's also a few times where Robert Hansen begins to stutter slightly.
At home there's no problem at all. I mentioned to you both that
And the real Robert Hansen was known to have a stammer, so I thought that was a nice touch. There's also a part where Hansen is in the woods with one of his victims and a random plane flies overhead. And Hansen locks eyes with it, but then the person just flies off. And one of the podcasts I listened to mentioned a man who was flying his plane around. And he spotted a two-seater light aircraft on the ground in the woods, which he thought was slightly strange. And Hansen on the ground spotted the plane and waved at him, and the plane just flew off. And during that encounter, Paula Goulding was restrained to an iron pipe in an old meat shack nearby. There's also a part that I thought was fully made up, and that's when Nicolas Cage's character talks about how his sister was killed by a drunk driver. And the movie kind of ties that into his whole motivation for helping Cindy. And the reason that I thought that was made up is because Nicolas Cage isn't directly playing a real person in this movie. Even though he is clearly based on Sergeant Glenflothy, I assumed that the movie took liberties and invented a backstory. But I googled it, and apparently Glenflothy's sister really was killed in a drunk driving incident, so I stand corrected there. However, and I'm going to preface this with the fact that I only watched a couple of documentaries about Robert Hansen, and the writer-director did 2 years of research on the subject. But there's several moments in The Frozen Ground that to me feel like they were made up for the movie. Like this part where Cindy Paulson is walking along the street and encounters a moose and starts staring at it. I'm not sure if that really happened, it feels very much like something out of a movie. And I've watched a lot of movies with scenes like this where the main characters lock eyes with an animal. Like the coyote scene in Collateral and the part with the stag and the queen, which is another biopic scene that I doubt really happened. I do like the scene with Cindy Paulson and the moose though. It is evocative, there's something strangely moving about it. And I guess you could say that both Cindy and the moose are prey in the eyes of a hunter like Robert Hansen. Also, Hansen's final breakdown confession scene in the movie seemed a little bit exaggerated to me compared to the other accounts that I've heard. I didn't read anything about him getting tricked with evidence or that Cindy Paulson walked into the interrogation room at the end, so I don't think that's true. Also, from what I've seen, I don't think Cindy ever stayed with the state trooper's family. I think she was put into a safe house. But I think that a little bit of bending of the truth here and there is fine as long as they don't go too overboard with it. But there's an entire storyline in this movie that I think was completely made up, and it kind of bothered me. So at one point, Hansen pays this shady club worker guy to kill Cindy. The guy then gets in contact with Cindy's pimp who owes him money, and he orders the pimp to bring Cindy to him. The pimp finds Cindy and drives her into a snowy forest where the guy is, and he's about to kill her. But then the pimp has a change of heart and stops the guy from killing her, but the pimp is murdered in the process. Cindy gets away, but then the guy tracks her down and holds her at gunpoint. But the police show up and save her, and the guy gets away, and he's never mentioned in the movie again. Now, I couldn't find any part of that ever happening in the research that I did. There's a possibility that it did happen and I just didn't come across it, but to me it just feels like the writer needed a bit of excitement in the third act and just made up all of that stuff. And that's the thing that I take issue with. I think that you should just let the true event speak for itself instead of inventing a whole cat and mouse chase to pique the interest of the audience. But again, I apologize in advance if that really was true. There's also a couple of cinematic flourishes to the movie that I thought were unnecessary. Like the movie opens with a Bible quote from Matthew 10:16 about sheep in the midst of wolves. And this isn't usually the kind of thing I would even bring up in a review, but I just thought it was an unnecessary way to kick off this true story. And I get that they were trying to set a mood, but it only tangentially relates to the themes of the story. And if you're gonna use a Bible verse about wolves, then surely the one about beware of wolves in sheep's clothing would be more apt for a movie about a killer that everybody thinks is a model citizen. There's another production choice in the movie that I took slight issue with, and that's during the end credits where it shows the images of the real victims. And that's not the thing I have an issue with, and I actually thought that it was a poignant way to end the movie by paying tribute to the victims. But what cheapens it is the goddamn Goo Goo Doll sounding song that's playing in the background. Listen to this. It's loud and overbearing and it feels forced. We don't need music to tell us to be sad. Let the images speak for itself. Now, I don't know much about the director of the movie, Scott Walker. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. But I did like the way that this movie was directed for the most part. The presentation of The Frozen Ground has a very documentary-style fly-on-the-wall feel to it. There's lots of imperfect framing where you're like, why is the camera here? And there's several shots where people and objects obstruct our view, and I thought that was quite effective in adding a bit of realism. There were one or two times where I realized I was thinking more about the camera than the dialogue, but I think it mostly worked. I also liked the way the setting of Alaska was utilized in the movie. Apparently the director delayed filming for 5 months so he could shoot on the cusp of autumn, starting with no snow and ending in deep winter, because he said that he wanted to capture the feeling of the weather closing in on the story and freezing the case. And it is noticeable that we see the town get snowier as the movie goes along. I've just personally always been drawn to horror movies and thrillers that take place in a snowy landscape. I think it adds something to the atmosphere. And there's a lot of gorgeous shots of mountains and scenery in the movie. You know, if this wasn't a true story about murder and rape, I'd say Frozen Ground makes Alaska look like a beautiful place to visit. So let's talk about the cast, starting with Nicolas Cage. Apparently Nicolas Cage was initially offered the role of Robert Hansen, but instead Nicolas Cage wanted to play the detective because he thought it would be more challenging for him as an actor. Although you'd think that playing a forgettable, inconspicuous kind of a guy that blends into society would be more of a challenge for Nicolas Cage. Like I said earlier, the person that Nicolas Cage is playing in the movie isn't 100% based on a real person, unlike a lot of the rest of the cast. So I don't feel completely like an asshole when I say that as a character, he does feel somewhat cliche. He's only 2 weeks from retirement and he's constantly bickering with his wife. And maybe that stuff was based on reality, but it still feels quite familiar. But I think quite smartly the movie doesn't revolve around his home life and personal struggles, and it's more about his quest to put Robert Hansen behind bars. Nicolas Cage's performance in this movie is understandably restrained, and he doesn't get a ton of moments to fully showcase his acting chops. But Cage is good in the role, and he does have some standout scenes, like the monologue about his sister's death that I talked about earlier. I like that Cage doesn't oversell it. He delivers it naturally, and it's effective. I also liked how calm he was during the interrogation sequences, which I thought juxtaposed quite well with John Cusack's demeanor towards the end. So John Cusack plays Robert Hansen, and I do think he does kind of look like him. Although if I was doing the casting, I might have gone for Guy Pearce. Anybody else see it? John Cusack is one of those actors where I often enjoy the films that he's in, like Con Air, obviously, but I don't think I've ever watched a movie where I've been like, wow, John Cusack really knocked it out the park on this one. I don't dislike him, but to me as an actor, he's usually just there. Which, when you think about it, is perfect casting for Robert Hansen, the guy that nobody thought twice about. But I've gotta say, I thought John Cusack was great in this movie. He does a good job during the scenes that make him out to be a regular Joe. But he also nails the creepy parts, and I was legitimately impressed by Cusack's performance here. I also really liked his gradual breakdown during the questioning in the third act, where at first he's still trying to remain charming to the cops, then we see him begin to get annoyed. His blinking becomes erratic and we can see something bubbling under the surface, until he finally erupts and screams the C word and spits up on his chin.
You little cunt! You think you can threaten me with this little whore?
Bob, take it easy.
I should have killed you when I had the chance!
And I think the scene is extra impactful because it's John Cusack of all people. If it was Nicolas Cage screaming and dribbling on himself, it would just be a Tuesday. Vanessa Hudgens plays the real-life sex worker and rape victim Cindy Paulson. I will say that I thought her dialogue in this movie was a little bit bizarre at times. Like there's a scene where she tearfully recounts her ordeal to the police about her abduction and sexual assault. But then the next time she talks to Nicolas Cage, she's just casually making flippant comments.
Have you ever seen a glacier? Or like, you love animals or anything?
And to me, I thought that was a little bit strange in terms of tone. But as I said earlier, the real Cindy Paulson was consulted for this movie, and it's quite possible that she did say stuff like that. And after all, she was a teenager with a hard life that did drugs. It's not completely unbelievable that she did bounce around in terms of mood. There are a couple of times that I thought Vanessa Hudgens struggled a bit in her performance, possibly because of the dialogue.
Oh, you didn't know I've been a host since like the 6th grade? Some dumb pimp's bitch?
And I also don't think she's quite believable as an 18-year-old. I think Vanessa Hudgens was in her mid-20s at the time. But I do think that Hudgens mostly does a good job here, and I think she nails a lot of the emotional beats. And the fact that Hudgens is playing a real person that went through awful trauma means that it was important that the role was handled delicately, and I think that it was for the most part. As for the rest of the cast, Dean Norris, aka Hank from Breaking Bad, plays an officer that's assisting Nicolas Cage, and it's always cool to see him pop up. And we also have 50 Cent in the movie as Cindy Paulson's pimp, as part of the storyline I discussed earlier that I think was made up. He was also one of the producers of this movie, which maybe explains why they invented a whole subplot surrounding his character. And I've got to admit, it's a little bit hard to take 50 Cent seriously in this movie with that Cat Williams hairdo he's rocking. He's a PIMP with a PERM. So overall, This movie is solid. For me, it was a nice change from these low-budget thrillers where Nicolas Cage runs around New Orleans for an hour and a half and everybody's just there for the paycheck. The Frozen Ground has a lot more artistry to it than those movies, and it's telling a story that's actually worth telling as opposed to a time killer like Stolen, Trespass, Seeking Justice, etc. The acting is strong almost all across the board, and I like the direction, although it's not quite on the level of a David Fincher production, obviously. And the movie doesn't reinvent the wheel as far as thrillers go, but it's based on a true story, so there's only so much you can do with that. And having done a little bit of research on the subject myself, I respect that the movie doesn't really editorialize or sensationalize the true story, for the most part. I personally wish that they utilized more of the true story and that they didn't go for the microcosm approach that they did by showing such a brief portion of the true case. But as it stands, I thought this movie was legitimately quite good and I recommend it. So the next movie Nicolas Cage was in was Joe, so until then, thanks for watching.